Well, hey, friends, welcome to Q on Q. We're glad you're with us this week. We're in our second week of our new series called Impressions. To give you a brief summary of what we've been talking about and what this series is going to be all about, impressions are a part of almost everything we do. And we're going to be reflecting on the marks we leave on others through words, actions, and even, yes, those subtle glances, and how those impressions align with God's call to love and understand one another. Last time, we looked at first impressions and second chances. If you didn't have a chance to listen last time, here's a quick recap of what we talked about. When we see someone, meet someone, we have an interaction with someone, we form an impression. We all know that first impressions can be powerful, but they aren't always accurate. What happens when we extend grace, offer second chances, and see others as God sees them? We reflected on the fact that the Bible reminds us that while humans look at the outward appearance, God looks at the heart. So that brings us to today. Today we're going to look at perhaps the biggest impression of them all, and one we often overlook: what God sees in us. Think about that very statement and ask yourself this question. Have you ever wondered what God sees when He looks at you? Have you ever stood in front of a mirror and thought, is this all there is? Maybe you focus on your flaws, a wrinkle here, a scar there, or the way your hair never quite cooperates. But it's not just physical. Sometimes the reflection we see goes deeper than skin. Those inner doubts that creep in, whispering reminders of our mistakes, our shortcomings, and all the ways we feel we don't measure up. It's easy to get stuck viewing ourselves through a warped lens, one clouded by insecurity, past failures, or the expectations of other people. But I'm going to repeat that opening question, and I want you to really let it sit with you today. What does God see when He looks at you? Is it possible that His view is completely different from ours? What if, instead of seeing our flaws and failures, He sees something beautiful, something full of potential, something worthy of love right now as we are? Today, we're going to explore that idea, what God sees when He looks at us. And spoiler alert, it's probably far better than what we see in ourselves. I'll be sharing about how God sees beyond our flaws, how He sees our untapped potential, and how He sees a worth that isn't tied to our performance or mistakes. I hope that by the end of this conversation this week, you'll have a clearer sense of how to step into that truth and see yourself just a little more like God does. So let's dive in and discover what happens when we trade our broken mirrors for God's perfect reflection. No matter how strongly we feel about ourselves, we often view ourselves through a lens of insecurity, past mistakes, or cultural expectations. God's view of us is often radically different from our view of ourselves. Why? Well, first, I think a lot of us are afraid to think super positively of ourselves because society tells us that thinking too highly of ourselves is egotistical. We're often taught that humility means downplaying our gifts, brushing off compliments, and focusing on our flaws to stay humble. But that's not true humility. That's insecurity disguised as virtue. True humility isn't about thinking less of yourself. It's about recognizing your worth without letting it inflate your ego. It's knowing you're valuable because God created you, not because of what you've achieved or how you compare to others. When we avoid thinking positively about ourselves, we can end up rejecting the very gifts that God has given us. Imagine telling an artist that their masterpiece isn't good enough, or criticizing the beauty of a sunrise. That would feel wrong, wouldn't it? But we do that very thing to ourselves when we dismiss the good things God has planted in us. Accepting who we are as beloved creations of God isn't arrogance, it's gratitude and stewardship. Seeing ourselves through God's eyes allows us to love others better, too, because we're not constantly caught up in self-doubt or comparison. So let's talk for a minute about how easy it is to focus on our flaws. I'm not just talking about the way we look, although that can certainly be a part of it. I'm talking about the internal list we keep, every mistake we've made, every skill we feel we're lacking, every way we think we fall short compared to others. We live in a world that loves to remind us of those shortcomings. Social media highlights everyone's best moments, making us feel like we're always a step behind. Performance reviews at work focus on what we need to improve. Even conversations with friends can sometimes leave us wondering if we're measuring up. We take all these things in, and over time, we start to believe a distorted version of who we are. But here's what's remarkable: God doesn't see us through that lens of imperfection. When He looks at you, He sees His beloved creation made in His image. That means there's inherent beauty, value, and worth in you, not because of what you've done or how perfect you appear to others, but because of who made you. God sees beyond your flaws to the masterpiece He's created. Think about an artist working on a sculpture. The rough marble might look messy to somebody who walks by and sees nothing but jagged edges, but the artist knows what lies beneath. They see the beauty already there, waiting to be revealed. That's how God looks at us. Even when we see our own rough edges, He sees the finished work, the person we're becoming through His love and grace. One of the biggest lies we tell ourselves is that we have to fix all of our flaws before we can be loved or accepted. And that's not the truth at all. Look at what it says in Romans 5. It begins by exploring the great benefits that come with being declared righteous by God. It describes how we can have hope instead of fearing judgment. Is this hope risky? Well, Paul says it's not. Why? Because God has proved that love to us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God didn't wait for us to get stronger or better. He acted first to resolve the dispute between us. He sent Christ to die at exactly the right time to save us. That means we are fully loved right now, not after we clean ourselves up or achieve some better version of ourselves or some version of perfection. Imagine the freedom that comes with knowing you don't have to earn love. God's love is already yours. There's one thing that sets God apart from how the world views us. It's this: God doesn't just see who we are right now, He sees who we're becoming. He looks past our current limitations and sees the potential that He's planted within us. The world often labels us based on what we've already accomplished or our past mistakes or even how we look on the surface. But God doesn't put us in those boxes. He sees us through the lens of grace and growth. Think about David. When Samuel went out to find the future king of Israel, David wasn't even in the room. His father brought out all of David's older, stronger brothers, but God didn't choose any of them. Instead, He chose the youngest shepherd boy, the one overlooked by everyone else. Why? Because God saw in David not just a shepherd boy, but a future king, a man after His own heart. The same is true for us. God sees beyond what we are right now. He knows our struggles, but He also knows the gifts we fully haven't tapped into yet. Maybe you're somebody who feels stuck in a job or a season of life that doesn't reflect who you want to be. Or maybe you're afraid to step out and pursue a dream because you think you're not ready. God already sees the potential in you, and He's calling you to step into it. It's important to remind ourselves that God's view of potential isn't about worldly success. It's not about becoming famous or wealthy or powerful. It's about becoming the person He created you to be. Somebody who reflects His love, His courage, and creativity in the world. And sometimes that means stepping up in leadership, but other times it means growing in patience, kindness, or faithfulness right where you are. When we start seeing ourselves through God's eyes, we can take risks and push past fear. We don't have to wait until we have it all figured out because God is already working through us, even in our imperfect state. It says in Philippians 1:6, "He who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus." God never gives up on us, and He never sees us as a finished product. There's always room for growth. What potential might God see in you right now that you're not fully recognizing? Where might He be asking you to trust Him and to step into something new? One of the most transformative truths of faith is that your worth is not tied to your accomplishments or failures. But if we're honest, that idea can be hard to accept sometimes. Society constantly measures our value based on what we achieve, how we look, how many followers we have on Facebook. We're taught from a young age that success, recognition, and perfection define us. But God sees things differently. His love for us isn't transactional. It doesn't go up when we're successful and plummet when we fall short. Think about what that means. God's worth for you was already determined long before you accomplished anything or messed anything up. You are valuable simply because you are His creation. Just as a parent loves their child unconditionally, God loves you because you belong to Him. But we often forget this, don't we? We compare ourselves to others thinking, well, I'll be worthy when I reach that level of success, or I'll matter once I stop messing up. But God's love doesn't work like that. When He looks at you, He sees a person of infinite value, someone worth sacrificing everything for, including the life of His Son. Here's a practical way to think about it. Imagine that you own a precious family heirloom. Maybe it's a piece of jewelry or an old watch passed down through generations. Even if it's scratched or tarnished, or maybe doesn't tick like it used to, it's still priceless because of where it came from and what it represents. That's how God sees us. We might be a little scratched up by life, but our value never changes because we belong to Him. So, I think we can all admit that this is a pretty big topic, and some of the things today may feel like they were repeated 100 times. It's because they're important. We've talked about how God sees beyond our flaws, recognizing beauty and value in us even when we struggle to see it ourselves. We discussed how He sees our potential, not just who we are now, but who we're becoming through His love and grace. We looked at the unshakable truth that our worth isn't earned through achievements or erased by failures. It's rooted in God's unconditional love. So, what do we do with all this? What changes when we start to see ourselves through God's eyes? Well, one major shift is freedom. Freedom from the need to constantly prove ourselves to others or even to ourselves. When you know that you are already seen, loved, and valued by the one who created the universe, you can stop striving for validation and start living with confidence and joy. But here's the thing. This isn't just about how we see ourselves. When we begin to accept God's perspective on our lives, it changes how we see others. Suddenly, we can look beyond their flaws, just as God looks beyond ours. We can see their potential and their inherent worth, even when they don't recognize it in themselves. That kind of shift in perspective can transform our relationships and make us vessels of God's grace in the world. It's also worth mentioning this isn't a one-time realization. Seeing ourselves and others through God's eyes should be, and needs to be, a daily practice. There will be days when insecurity or frustration creeps back in, but that's when we return to the truth that God's vision of us never wavers. His love is constant, and so is our worth. So, I have a few challenges for you this week, because not only is this a lot to absorb, It can only become part of who we are if we're intentional about it. First, spend some time this week, intentional time, asking God to show you how He sees you. Maybe that's through prayer or journaling or simply sitting in silence and listening for His voice. Then, take it a step further. Ask Him to show you someone else through His eyes and see what changes in your heart. The next time you're tempted to dwell on your flaws, pause. Ask yourself, is this how God sees me? And if the answer is no, let it go. Replace that negative thought with a reminder of who God says you are: beloved, valued, and created for a purpose. The more we align our view of ourselves with God's perspective, the more peace and confidence we can walk in each day. Walk in that truth and let it shape how you see yourself and how you treat others. Remember, the world may try to define you by your flaws or your achievements, but God's view of you is so much greater. Live in that truth. Let it shape your thoughts, your actions, and your relationships. And when the doubts come, and they will, return to the foundational truth that you are fully seen, fully loved, and deeply valued by the one who created you. Well, friends, thanks for joining me today. I hope this conversation encourages you to walk with renewed confidence and compassion. Next time, we're going to take this to the final part of this series, and we're going to talk about maybe an impression that's even bigger than the one we spoke about today, and that's the image we bear. How can we reflect God's character in our impressions? We're going to explore how being made in His image impacts how we view and judge others, and how it should be through a lens of grace and love rather than preconceived notions. Well, till next time, take care and walk in the freedom of knowing you are already enough in God's eyes. I really do appreciate you tuning in again this week. We'll see you back here next time, and we'll have more for you on Cue.